Chapter 3. Belize was a small country, and like many Belizeans, Simo was a frequent visitor to neighboring Guatemala and Mexico. Inevitably, over the years, he developed an interest in archaeology and, by extension, the conquest of the pre-Columbian civilizations. Though he was no expert, he realized the glyphs were not the kind he was used to seeing in the local museum, or at the different archaeological sites in Belize, one of which was Altun Ha, just a few kilometers from his home outside Belize City. He had often taken visitors to Altun Ha and was familiar with the Maya writing system that decorated the facades of many of its buildings. Although it was smaller than other sites in the country, it consisted of two main plazas surrounded by more than a dozen pyramids and residential structures. Hundreds of other buildings, still covered by the jungle, lay untouched as they had for hundreds of years, waiting for archaeologists with the financial means to explore. After comparing the illustrations in the ancient book to the photos in those he had just bought, he scratched his head disappointedly and turned his attention to the handwritten texts, part of which he recognized as Old Spanish and very difficult to follow. As he turned the pages, an envelope fell to the floor. He picked it up. It was addressed to whom it may concern. Inside was a letter written by Wallace. It was brief, announcing the book had been given to him in exchange for services rendered by the family from whom he had bought the land surrounding his villa, an old family descended from English settlers that had been present in 1862, when Belize, then known as British Honduras, was declared a British Crown colony. The book had been handed down for safekeeping from generation to generation, a family heirloom. They had claimed to be descended from the English privateers who had used the coast as their base to raid the Spanish treasure fleets, sailing from the New World to Spain in the early 17th century. Over the centuries, like most families in Belize, they became part of that conflux of humanity, an extraordinary melting pot, where their English, Spanish, African, and more recently Indian and Chinese ancestors met and mingled with the descendants of the Maya, giving many that undefinable appearance. Wallace briefly noted that after acquiring visas to the US with his help, the family had vanished into the masses of recent arrivals, somewhere in the vast urban sprawl of New York City and its outlying districts. The book, dated from 1579 according to Wallace, was written in two texts, both in the Roman alphabet, Spanish and another language, which Simo did not recognize. In addition were the ideographic signs. It vaguely recalled a codex. However, rather than the screen-folded Maya codices, it was bound like an old but conventional book. It was evidently not a facsimile. He had seen one of those in the Belize Museum. This book was worn, not damaged, but simply worn at the edges, by time and many hands. He Googled Codex and discovered numerous such texts existed. A little more research confirmed it could be of value, and if it really was authentic, perhaps of great value. There was, however, a downside. It appeared there existed a number of famous forgeries, to which were regularly added new discoveries. With further search and cross-referencing, he came to the conclusion the other language was Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, which seemed strange, as Belize was far from the region in Mexico where that language had been and still was spoken. Simo couldn't help asking himself about Wallace's intentions. He had evidently realized the book's value, perhaps not its worth in dollars and cents, but its possible historical value. But then there was another question, that of the other cases in the Freeport warehouse. Almost certainly paintings. Where could they have come from? Wallace had not been a rich man in the sense he could have accumulated an art collection. Who else could be interested in such treasure? He returned to Google and came across a report on a recent Sotheby's sale of pre-Columbian art. There was the picture of a vase with the words "Type Codex." It was just 12 centimeters high and was auctioned for 100,000 euros. He continued his search. There existed many different types of codices, certain of which were described as priceless. Not only would it be difficult to sell, it would certainly be seen as a national cultural treasure by Belize or other countries that could make claims, and would require a very wealthy buyer. Legally, antiquities found in Mesoamerica should be declared to the local authorities by the finders. However, the Codex was not an archaeological discovery, but a possession of the deceased's family and for many generations. After re-inspecting the manuscript, for that is what it was, a book written and illustrated by hand, he pursued his search, following the links to museums and historical libraries and learned institutions. Soon he discovered images of the Florentine Codex at the Biblioteca Medicia Laurentiana, a world-famous library in Florence, Italy, and was astonished by the remarkable similarities with the manuscript now in his possession. Then, after downloading an illustrated publication of the Codex from Texas University, he spent the following couple of hours studying the extraordinary work, and came to the conclusion the manuscript in his possession was either a real addendum to the work produced by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, or a very clever forgery. If the Wallace Codex, as he now called it in his mind, was the real thing, it could be worth millions, and if he could find a buyer, the proceeds would transform his now very anemic retirement plan into one that would enable him to live in the kind of style that had eluded him during his long years in the grubby tropical backwater that now threatened to make him its prisoner. He decided to eat in the hotel restaurant with its magnificent view over the lake, but found it difficult to concentrate on anything but the Codex he had left in the safe box of his room. As he ate, different ideas raced through his mind, mixed with a rerun of his visit to the Freeport. Looking out at the lake, he took a breath and paused, making an effort to reorganize his thoughts. At that precise moment, a large motor yacht passed in the middle distance. Suddenly, Sir Patrick Kennedy sprung to mind, a rich banker who had visited Belize a couple of years earlier aboard his yacht. Amongst Kennedy's friends was a Spanish archaeologist and a Parisian fine arts dealer, an Englishman, or was he Irish? He pulled out his phone and started to run through his contacts. He stopped at Scott Fitznorman of Asia Galleries in Paris. He looked at his watch. It was just after 7. He called for the check, returned to his room, where he called Fitznorman, who to his relief replied. "Hello, Mr. Fitznorman," he commenced, preferring a formal approach to start with. "This is Barry Simmons of Young and Simmons, Belize attorneys. Perhaps you remember us from your visit to Belize City with Sir Patrick Kennedy, about 18 months ago." He hesitated, then for good measure added, "Our firm introduced Sir Patrick to Audrey Joy Grant. She's the governor of the Belize Central Bank." It was a bit of an exaggeration in the sense Simo had introduced Pat Kennedy at a crowded Independence Day cocktail. "Yes, of course, Barry. I remember we met at the Radisson," Fitznorman replied. He was a well-known international art dealer, and remembering names and faces was part of his business. Simo was relieved, though he was not naive. "I'm calling from Geneva on behalf of a client." "I see. How can I be of help?" It wasn't the first time a lawyer called him on behalf of a real or pretended client about an objet d'art. "Are you familiar with the Florentine Codex?" "Yes, of course." "Good. Well, I won't go into details over the phone. Where can we meet?" "Well, I'm afraid I'm in Spain at the moment, San Sebastian. I'm here for an ethnic art fair until the end of the week." "I'll be there tomorrow afternoon," announced Simmons, recalling San Sebastian was in the north of the country, a largest city, a few hours' drive from Madrid. "I see. I'm staying at Hotel de Londres et d'Ingleterre. Do you need a room?" "Yes. If you could manage that for me. One other thing, this is strictly between us, you know, lawyers' confidentiality. You can count on me, replied Fitznorman, intrigued by Simmons, whom he remembered being a rather amusing, slightly worn expatriate, rather out of place in Belize, which had struck him as a steaming and threatening backwater. Simmons booked a seat on the early Iberia flight that left at 7:10 and arrived in Madrid 2 hours later. It was perfect. The 4-hour drive to San Sebastian meant he would arrive sometime in the early afternoon if all went well. He passed a restless night and was awake at 5, and as he drank his coffee, he continued to compare his manuscript with the Texas University publication, which described the 12 books of the Florentine Codex. It was, however, a necessarily brief description, as the original in the Bibliotheca Medicia Laurentiana was made up of 3 books and totaled 3,120 pages. Compiled between 1576 and 1577, the Codex was the work of one Bernardino de Sahagún, who had arrived in Mexico in 1529. The books were transcribed from accounts of life in Mexico prior to the conquest, recounted by different Aztec people, high-ranking individuals who had witnessed the collapse of Montezuma's empire and the Spanish conquest. In 1569, after Bernardino reorganized and corrected the different accounts, they were bound into books and sent to Madrid, where it was believed the Codex was offered as a gift of Philip II of Spain to the Grand Duke of Tuscany in around 1589. Simo then noted the existence of another manuscript from that period. It dated from around 1580 and was kept in the collection of the Royal Academy in Madrid, known as the Tolosa Codex. It was acquired from the Franciscan convent of Tolosa in Navarre in 1873. During the flight to Madrid, thanks to the books he had bought in Geneva, he swatted up on the history of the Conquista and learnt more of Bernardino, who had arrived at Veracruz on the Caribbean coast at the age of 29. He lived in Mexico to what was a great age in those times, more than 90 years old, never returning to Spain. Sahagún's work was considered to be one of the most outstanding ethnographic documents of pre-Columbian Mexico, since it provided detailed accounts of Mexican life during the 15th and 16th centuries, just before the cataclysmic collapse of the Aztec world, that brought about the destruction of its political system and the extinction of most of its traditions and beliefs. Beyond the chronicle of the conquest, seen from an Aztec standpoint, it described the existence of botanical gardens and zoos in Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, as well as in other cities of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. It was the only surviving account of life in Mexico, as told by Aztecs. Just 10 years after Cortés landed in Veracruz, the start of the conquest, which ended with the death of Montezuma II on June 29, 1521, and the fall of Tenochtitlan in the summer of 1522, when the besieged defenders, plagued by smallpox and dysentery, starving and without fresh water, were finally forced into submission on August the 13th. The conquistadors established their new capital, now Mexico City, on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, a city of more than 400,000 with its outlying areas, comparable to the largest European city of that time, the capital of an empire of 15 million people. At the time of the conquest, the library of Tenochtitlan held thousands of written works. Tragically, the Spanish destroyed almost all of the library's codices, long scrolls folded into books, obliterating forever the Aztec traditions and beliefs in the Spanish king's determination to convert his new subjects to Christianity. Fewer than 20 codices survived. Simo was fascinated to learn that hyperspectral scanning of a Mayan codex held in the Bodleian Library by researchers at Oxford University had revealed unknown images hidden beneath a layer of plaster and gesso, a series of figures laid out like a comic strip. The codex, acquired from John Selden in the 17th century, measured 5 meters in length, written on deerskin and folded like an accordion into a book. In the 1950s, researchers scraped off a small quantity of paint, revealing a layer of images that had been painted over, indicating the support had been reused. To avoid further damage to the precious document, the investigation was abandoned until new technology was developed in the form of hyperspectral imaging, which revealed pictures executed with red, orange and yellow pigments. A total of 27 human figures wearing headdresses and carrying spears were identified on just one page. It confirmed the document was a palimpsest, that is, a recycled support, and what was more astonishing was the text did not match that of other earlier manuscripts used in Mesoamerica before the conquest. Further, Simo learned the Mayan language was neither Mixtec, Nahuatl, nor Zapotec, but a separate family, which continued to be widely spoken, since the Maya resisted the conquistadors almost 2 centuries longer than the Aztecs and the Incas. The flight was otherwise uneventful and on time, and when Simo landed in Madrid, he was somewhat wiser as to the language and the history of the region in which he had lived for almost 3 decades. After deplaning, he took the Schengen customs control line, where, looking straight ahead, he acted as nonchalantly as possible. He was in luck. He passed unchallenged, and 5 minutes later he was in the arrivals hall, still hanging tightly onto his briefcase and the 2 carry-ons, allowed for business-class travellers. His precautions were justified, considering he was carrying the valuable Codex as well as an unusually large sum of cash. He headed directly for the herd's counter, where he rented a comfortable Seat Ateca for the 4-hour drive to San Sebastian.